Brilliant. Well, let's get on with it. We are delighted that, as at our previous event last year, and indeed the US version of this event earlier this year, I am joined once again by Jack Hidary of Sandbox AQ. So Jack, please come up onto the stage. Please welcome Jack Hidary. It's great to have you here again. So the great thing about Jack is that Jack could zoom in on the tiniest details of quantum. You literally wrote the book on this, but can also zoom out to the big picture. And so what I thought...
Tom, can I just say that you mentioned caffeine, very, very important ingredient for today. But usually when we're talking quantum, we like to have another substance, alcohol, which helps get the mind going for quantum, but it's still too early in the morning for this.
It is.
Maybe next time we should do an evening session to bring the alcohol.
Well, there will be alcohol at the end.
Okay, good.
So I think we'll start.
So we'll revisit.
We'll work our way up to it.
Okay, good.
There's also caffeinol, which is where it's a therapy for strokes, where you give people caffeine and alcohol simultaneously. Apparently, it's very effective. Right. Anyway, moving on. So for this introductory session, we thought we'd sort of remind ourselves of the big picture and sort of the potential here, and the potential for quantum technology in general to address a really big problem. And they don't come really any bigger than climate change and sort of environmental challenges related to it. So where do we start? So we thought this might be rather than sort of talking about this in general, we would zoom in on that particular problem. So how might quantum technologies help us? Well, let's start, before we get onto the sort of solution, how might these technologies first actually enable us to understand the scale and the nature of the problem?
Yeah. Well, climate change is a critical question, and also I think we may, if we have time, get into related issues of our human impact on the environment. The plastic that we consume and then throw out has now been distributed across the entire ocean. Samples were recently taken as far south as Antarctica and as far as north as the North Pole, finding little plastic microbeads. So we unfortunately have our footprint everywhere. The key thing, Tom, about this era now, AI and quantum, is that we can move beyond just the bits era of the technology sector to bits and atoms. And that's a fundamental shift in our tech sector. The tech sector has done a great job, I would say, in terms of bits. We can move bits, we can store bits, we can cyber protect bits, we can think about how to analyze bits using machine learning, as an example. But as a tech sector, I would give us a failing grade in terms of the world of atoms. We think about how we generate molecules to medicines, how we generate medicines today. We're still basically using the techniques of 10, 20 years ago, which is why it still takes 13, 14 years, 2 billion pounds to make one medicine. And even with that, an 80% failure rate in clinical phase trials. When it comes to material science, which we're going to focus on today, because that's critical to the climate change issue. When we think about replacing plastics, when we think about new kinds of solar panels, when we think about battery chemistry, these are issues of atoms. And we have not really, we as a tech sector, have not given sufficient tool sets to these industries to really innovate in a massive way. So I hope this is the beginning now of a new era of the tech sector, bits and atoms. And I think that's where now quantum can really play a major role.
Okay, so is it predominantly in using quantum devices to simulate and discover new materials? Do you think that's where the opportunity is?
I think there's one massive opportunity in terms of the simulation, and we can now do so both with quantum techniques on current chips. So when we think about the rise of the GPU, I'm sure everyone here has holding stock of NVIDIA. I hope everyone here has their stock in NVIDIA. If you do, you've done very well in the past number of years.
800% or something.
Exactly. And NVIDIA and many other companies have produced these incredible chips. Initially, the G, of course, in GPU for graphics to make our video games better. Wonderful contribution to the world. But every time you see a teenager playing a video game, thank that teenager, because those GPUs driving better video games have led to not only the ChatGPTs of the world now, but as importantly, maybe more importantly, the ability to run quantum simulation on large arrays of GPUs. And so today's GPUs form the basis of running these equations given to us 100 years ago by Schrodinger, by Heisenberg, by Dirac, and others. We can now run them at scale on these large GPUs. And of course, one day we'll be joined there in QPUs, quantum processing units, in a GPU-QPU hybrid mesh. So this ability to now run quantum equations leads us to the simulation. But it's not just simulation. We can also think about quantum sensing. When we want to sense how we're doing in terms of climate change, what is the impact, we want to sense the world around us. we need to use new kinds of sensors. And quantum allows us to move into new regimes of sensing. An example. It's very important when we think about the acidity of the ocean, which is one of the impacts of climate change, to put underwater ROVs. Well, guess what? Let's say you want your ROV to go in a certain direction and map out a certain place and sense the acidity in a particular area, salinity, so on and so forth. Turns out that just 1 meter below the surface of the ocean, there is no GPS. And recently we had a visit up to BASS. Anyone know what the initials BASS stand for? It's up in Cambridge here in UK. BASS? British Antarctic Survey. Right. Correct. Excellent. T-shirt, please, for the lady. And BASS is the largest dedicated organization in the world to polar science. It's called the Antarctic Survey, but actually they do Arctic as well. And they have 2 ROVs, underwater ROVs, that look like kind of torpedoes. And unfortunately, both of them are broken right now because they didn't have great navigation underwater, and they both hit seawalls. However, with quantum navigation, the ability to sense the magnetic field of the Earth, the way that whales do, the way that birds do, and navigate underwater without GPS.
Some people, apparently.
And some people.
Yeah, seriously, there are people who can tell you which way north is.
Yeah, there are reports with an intrinsic nature of that. But we know, of course, that whales do this, and that's how they migrate, and so expertly. But we now can empower these underwater ROVs with quantum navigation using the magnetic lines of the Earth, thus being able to sense our oceans in a much better way, which is critical to understanding the impact of climate change. So simulation, certainly, but also sensing as well.
And crucially, neither of those examples rely on us having large-scale quantum computers.
No quantum computer yet. So again, we are very hopeful and we're excited about the rise of the quantum computers at scale. We talk about fault tolerance, error correction, and in the coming years, I'm expecting great breakthroughs from our counterparts and colleagues who are making these quantum computers. We, in our company, do not produce or make any quantum computer because we want to work with all the folks making these quantum computers. And as I think the audience knows, Tom, there are 7 different ways of making a quantum computer, 7 physics altogether. And that, by the way, is an interesting recursion. We can possibly use quantum simulation today on GPUs to help design better physics for the building of quantum computers as well. So,
there's so much of this recursion going on.
Yes.
It's like using ChatGPT to figure out what's happening inside, I think it's GPT-2.
Yes,
so they're using
exactly.
this year's model to look inside the brain.
The last year's one.
Yeah, exactly. And there are other examples of this too. I know AQ in the name of your company stands for AI and quantum, and we talked about this last year, and I was like, oh, come on, you're just being buzzword compliant. Where's the AI in all of this really? Is there AI in this one too? Make the case that there might be.
We try to put as many buzzwords in one sentence as possible. Well, first of all, we can't use AI for everything. So first, let me just talk about the Q, and then we'll come back to the A. When we want to think about AI, we often need large data sets because most of AI today, 99% of when we talk about AI is supervised learning. Learning where we have large data sets. In the case of ChatGPT, the data set...
No, hang on, it's self-supervised learning.
is the web itself.
It doesn't have to be labeled.
Exactly. But you need, large data in general. And when you don't have data, as in the case of material science, when we think about, for example, the large array of possible battery chemistries, there's no data to really go on because each of these possible chemistries, we haven't really produced many prototypes of this, so there's not much data to go on. And that's why we have to work from first principles. We have to use the mathematics of quantum itself, because that interaction, as these ions and atoms are interacting in the battery, that is a quantum interaction. That's not governed by the laws of Newton, but by the laws of quantum. However, once we build these electronic configurations, electronic referring to the electrons themselves, once we build these synthetic data sets, we can then apply machine learning to that to then sift through and optimize which of these electronic configurations would be optimal. So there's a role for AI to play after you have created your synthetic data set from scratch using mathematics first principles.
So hang on a minute. With something
this is a very different way of
No, I
using
realize
AI.
that. But with AlphaFold, that's mapping the
amino acid sequences
onto
a quaternary structure.
So why can we use AI for that? But because that isn't that a similar kind of problem where you're trying to figure out the sort of fundamental physical properties of a bunch of things?
Yeah. So in that case, actually, we have quite a bit of data of currently existing proteins that we found in nature.
Okay, so you can
and we can use that as a scaffolding to bootstrap ourselves up in the case of AlphaFold, which has been quite successful.
Okay, so going back to the quantum simulation, the fact that we can do it today on GPUs, who's doing this and where, and sort of where do you think what's the most promising stuff that's happening on this?
Yeah, well, with regards to climate change specifically and to environmental impact, I think there's a few areas to think about. First, in terms of renewable energy, we all want to see more renewable energy. So why isn't it happening? And there's several factors for it. There's regulatory, there's a lot of different issues, but one of the challenges continues to be price. We want to bring down the price of solar panels, as an example. And solar has come down already 80% in price over the last 5 years. That's good news. The problem is we still need to come down further if we're going to see more and more solar put out there. When I am on a plane looking over all those large buildings that you see near airports, warehouses, distribution centers, and I see no solar, it literally pains me because I know that these are flat roofs that could have massive amounts of solar. Why isn't it there? And in point of fact, if we were able to bring it down another 50, 60% in cost, we would reach the tipping point in many of these buildings where we could put solar on. We know, for example, that for climate change, the built environment is roughly 40% contributor to climate change, to greenhouse gas emissions. 27% in the electricity and power to run those buildings, and 13% of the 40% in terms of the built environment itself, the concrete that you actually, and the materials to make these buildings and to fix them up from time to time. So if we were able to bring in more renewable energy, that would be a positive thing. But today's solar panels are made from silicon. Crystalline silicon, to be specific, either polysilicon or monocrystalline silicon. These are two versions, and that's what you see out there, these hard, rigid, rather heavy panels that you have to pop onto a roof or in the field, and that's where solar comes from. However, there's been chemistries proposed in the literature and in labs, and we have yet to see them come out of the lab. What are we waiting for? An example of that would be perovskites. Perovskites is a word you can now use in a cocktail party to impress your friends. And perovskites...
Just don't put it in your drink.
Yes, exactly. Definitely don't do that. They're made of calcium and titanium, and they have the ability to have the photoelectric effect, just like silicon, where they can convert photons to electric energy. And that PV effect in perovskites has now gone from 3% efficiency to more than 27% efficiency just in the last 7 years. So we've made a lot of progress there. So why don't we see perovskite out there? Two main challenges. First, durability. To finance solar in the UK, in the US, in Europe, you need to have a 25-year lifetime projection usability for that solar panel. Perovskites, unfortunately, after about a year or two, start to degrade. So we've got to figure out chemistries that keep this thing stable. Now, if we were to physically try in a lab to concoct prototypes, billions and billions of prototypes, we'd be here for, thousands of years. Rather, we can use simulation to virtually, in a digital twin format, simulate the perovskite chemistry, and one that would have durability even under the sun for 25 years. Also, some perovskites contain lead or other toxic materials. We need to figure out how to remove that and to have a perovskite without some of those
You can
materials.
make these perovskite panels transparent as well, can't you? So you can put them on the outsides of buildings.
That's right. We call it BIPV, Building Integrated Photovoltaic. And also, by the way, they have the wonderful attribute that you can make them very flexible and rolled. So you can transport them easily, you can roll them anywhere, they're very light, and we would probably have a 10x impact of solar if we had perovskites. But that's a question of quantum simulation. And we hope that more and more labs will start using these tools now that GPUs and one day QPUs will be out there. So that's one area.
Okay, we haven't got very long, so I'm going to take that as an example. Just generally, okay, this is all very inspiring. We should be using more of this technology to find these, these opportunities.
Material science, yeah.
Right, exactly. So what can people in this room do to help out and to accelerate this process?
Well, I think that when many people here in this room are involved in quantum companies of various kinds. If you're involved, for example, in building a quantum computer itself, and there's quite a number of companies here doing so, we want to make sure that as those scale, we start integrating these QPUs, these quantum processing units, with the current GPUs and CPUs in this mesh architecture to harness the power of this combined compute to do these kinds of simulations. So the ability to start doing test runs on even these early quantum computers is a good practice run to make sure we can scale these things. In the chip sector, in semiconductors, we talk about co-design. That is, many of the new chips that are coming out have been co-designed with application developers, so that when the chip is made, it's understood what kind of application we're talking about. And NVIDIA, as an example, I have, I'm not on the board of NVIDIA, just in case you're wondering. Is an example of a company that's done very well with their CUDA platform, CUDA, and now others have followed suit. If you look at Intel.
They built these chips specifically to run machine learning loads.
Exactly.
Right.
So it started as graphics, but now they've actually co-designed with the ML people in mind.
So basically, the people working on the computer should be working closely
with application people like ourselves. And so if we can bring the application people and the chip people together, from the quantum side and the classic side, that would actually lead to more breakthroughs.
Okay, well, we could talk all day, and I hope I get to talk to you later today, but I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thank you very much, Jack Hidary.
Tom,
thank you.
Excellent.